afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this joint GIRI and Weightmans webinar. First of all, introducing myself. My name's Tom Barton, and I'm the Director of GIRI, and I'll introduce you to our colleagues from Weightmans shortly. So first of all, just dealing with a bit of housekeeping. This presentation is being recorded. We've got quite a lot of people attending, so therefore we were just going to use, would you please, any questions you've got, please use the Q&A tab, which is on the top of your screen, to ask any questions, and then we'll moderate them afterwards. And if you need any help, please also use the Q&A. If you can't hear something or something's not working, please use the Q&A on that as well. We've got quite a lot of people coming. They're still coming in, so it's just would be helpful if we do it that way. So our agenda is first of all an introduction from myself about GIRI and what we do and why we're doing this today. And then we're going to hear from Weightmans, who are going to talk about the building safety bill and what does that mean for you. And then hopefully some questions and answers at the end. So first of all, a little bit about GIRI. Some of you will have known this. Forgive me if you're seeing the same slide again, but I think it's quite important. So we did some research in 2015, which showed that the industry was wasting some 21% in correcting errors. So that was a terrible, and that's a terrible thing for us to do, and it gives us a terrible reputation. So we republished that research in a book called The Strategy for Change. And in it, we discussed some of the root causes of error. And one of the key things that we all need to do is to learn from our mistakes. So we set up a not-for-profit organization whose aim was simply to improve productivity and quality by eliminating error. And at the moment, we have some 56 members with a wide range of from all sectors of our industry, including obviously contractors, architects, insurance companies, and of course our friends Weightmans who are with us today. I think it's just important before we get into the meat of what we're going to talk about. It is just to remind you about one or two things that are coming out of the Grenfell inquiry. And I think just as people, we need to be thinking about that. And if you've not listened to any podcasts on BBC Sounds, I'd really recommend that you do. The first one that I referred to is podcast 86, and it's by a man called Marcia Gomez, who it's a recording, basically, not a complete recording, but a recording of his conversation with the 999 operator as he walked from level 18, or was it level 21, down to the bottom with his 7-month pregnant wife and 2 daughters. And he left his flat when the curtains in his bedroom were on fire. So he was one of the lucky ones because he escaped. And I'm just going to say one little thing about it, and that is I said level 18 or level 21. And that's because although in the refurbishment they changed the floor numbers, they hadn't changed the floor numbers on the staircases. So the firemen didn't know within 3 floors where they were supposed to go. So there's a little error which just added to the problems. And the second podcast is about very recent evidence in September. And one tiny piece of evidence from Ben Bailey, project manager for the cladding contractor. At the time of the installation, he was a 25-year-old who'd graduated 1 year earlier with a degree in business and construction management. Poor man having to live with this. So I wonder who was responsible for putting a man with limited experience and knowledge into that position. So it's well worth listening to. And I just think that, you know, we should all listen to it just to remind ourselves why we're doing what we're doing. And just in parallel with that, and I know Natalie's going to refer to it again a bit later on, but part of what we're supposed to be doing is looking at competencies and all of that. And this setting the bar is a publication that the Construction Leadership Council issued, I think last week, very recently anyway, and it's going to have a huge demand on our industry as to what we actually do. And then a final quote from me, and this again was last week from Dame Judith Hackett. If any part of this sector who thinks they can survive by standing still or defending their current territory is sadly mistaken. So she's of the view that we're not doing enough to get to where we need to go. And that's, of course, part of what GIRI is trying to do. So I'd like to introduce you now to Paul Lowe, who's going to be the next speaker, and he's going to talk to you from Weightmans. So Paul, over to you.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you for the very kind introduction. If you could just turn to the next slide, Tom, that would be very helpful indeed. For those of you who don't know me, I'm partner at Weightmans and specialise in construction and engineering risks. And I'm very lucky to be joined by my colleague Natalie Keys, who's also, as Tom has mentioned, going to be addressing the issue of the Building Safety Bill this afternoon. There's a well-known quote by Alexander Pope, which goes along the lines, "A little knowledge is a dangerous thing." And I think in some ways, how building safety has been dealt with over the past few years corresponds quite closely to what Alexander Pope was trying to get at there. And I hope that becomes clear as we go through the course of the presentation this afternoon. There is no doubt, at least in my mind, that the building safety bill is a seismic moment. That's what it's been described by commentators for the construction industry, and now really is the time to sit up, take notice, and act on what the bill is going to instigate, whilst there is still time and time is on our side. So there is so much to get at with the bill. Tom, if you could just turn to the next slide. As I said, there is so much to get at when it comes to the bill. We've had to put a bit of a programme in place for you this afternoon. As you'll see from this slide, I'll take you through a bit of the background to how we've got here and why we're here. We'll then have a look at the reformed building safety system, and Natalie will take us through that. We'll also take a look at what that means then for the types of issues you might find on site, and also what it might mean for your insurers in particular, because I think one area which hasn't received a great deal of attention yet is the likely impact of the bill for the insurance industry. We'll also see if we've got time to run through one or two case studies at the end before we go to the Q&A session. But as been mentioned already, please do put any questions you have into the Q&A box, which should be available to you all to see. I want to just emphasize one point really before we get into some of the detail of what it's all about. And that point is that it's a very human story which has generated this piece of legislation. It's a human story which encompasses tragedy, missed opportunities, and decisions which were missed or not taken. I don't think we should ever lose sight of that background. And you've heard Tom talk about some of the evidence coming out of the Grenfell inquiry. Of course, that has been the trigger for getting this legislation before Parliament. But we shouldn't lose sight of this. There's a very large human element to all of this. It's not just a question of black letter law. Okay, Tom, if you could just turn to the next slide, that'd be helpful. Okay, so a very, very brief introduction to the bill. As you'll see, it's published in draft on the 20th of July this year, and it's currently making its way through Parliament. I believe it's going before committee scrutiny this month. It is unquestionably a very complex piece of legislation, and it's been described, and I think rightly so, as a lawyer's paradise. Not that that's a bad thing from my perspective, but it certainly is complex. There are 5 parts and 119 sections, and we ought to also bear in mind that a great deal of the detail which will come out of the bill will be set out in secondary legislation, which we haven't yet seen. We should also bear in mind that the bill, as it goes through scrutiny in Parliament, is likely to change, and there will be opportunity for interested parties and for industry to have some influence over what the eventual legislation looks like. I guess for our purposes today, the main parts of this are part 2, where we see this new building safety regulator established, a long heralded development when it comes to building safety. Part 3 of the bill deals with the regulatory regime and takes that regime through from design to construction. And part 4 deals with how buildings which are in the scope of the bill are managed during the occupancy phase. I guess if anybody really wants to explore the bill in detail, perhaps the best place to start are the explanatory notes, which personally I think are fascinating. They set out the government's programme and what the objectives, the government's objectives are. When it comes to the legislation, they're fairly easily digestible, and I'd recommend anybody who's got an interest in this takes a look at those explanatory notes. They're freely available on the web for anyone who's interested. So that's the sort of the shape of the bill. But before we kind of get into the details of legislation, I'd just like to sort of cast our minds to why this is needed in the first place, and just for us to recap on the problems which have generated this need for legislation. If you go to the next slide, please, Tom. So where are we now, and how did we get here? That's what I was sort of casting my mind to this webinar. That there are 2 very obvious examples of fire safety problems which came immediately to my mind. First one was a devastating fire in Madrid in February 2005. I think if anybody had the opportunity to go to Madrid in the early noughties, you were likely to have seen or come across high-rise office block. It was known as Torre Windsor, in the centre of Madrid. During refurbishment works in February 2005, I believe there was an electrical fire. That fire spread very rapidly from the upper floors of the tower and became all-encompassing. I believe it took several days, in fact, for the Madrid Fire Brigade to put this particular fire out. Now, in the investigation that followed the Torre Windsor fire, it became pretty clear pretty quickly that one of the exacerbating factors for this particular fire was the ACM cladding found on this block, and this is one amongst a number of early warnings about the use of cladding and insulation on buildings, and it's as early as 2005. Thankfully, nobody was killed or injured in the Torre Windsor fire, but the warning signs started to come out. I think from then. Then fast forward a few years, a little bit closer to home, Lacanau House in July 2009. I'm sure all of us are familiar with this particular tragedy. A number of people lost their lives as a result of fire in a residential block in South London in July 2009. Again, a very similar sorry story arises in the investigation following Lacanau House. There was a coroner's inquiry, and the issue of the exterior cladding panels catching fire and burning through in less than 5 minutes was raised. It was also pointed out that the cladding panels enabled the fire to spread rapidly throughout the whole of that block. And in that instance, of course, a number of people lost their lives. So that was July 2009, and I think it was starting to become pretty clear that something needed to be done at that stage. I'm just going to read an extract from a letter which was written by the Secretary of State at the time, Eric Pickles, to the coroner, and he addresses a number of points in his letter. I'll only read a short extract, but I think it's quite instructive. So he firstly says, we have considered your recommendation that those responsible for high-rise buildings be required to provide relevant information for operational purposes. He then goes on to say, on balance, we consider that a regulatory requirement is unnecessary and disproportionate. He then finishes the letter as follows. Finally, in relation to building regulations, I have noted your concerns about the difficulties that some of those involved in the inquest had with the interpretation of approved document B. I can assure you that my department is committed to a programme of simplification. Just to pause there, that letter was written in 2010, and in it the Secretary of State, I think, just taking it apart, makes two key points. Firstly, that at that stage he wasn't interested or didn't have a clear view about the requirements for a fresh regulatory regime. And secondly, when it came to approved document B, which I'm sure many of us are now familiar with, there would be a review, but that was going to take some time and was a matter of considering complex issues which are not going to be addressed overnight. What really happened was that this was kicked into the long grass, and the political motivation to deal with these issues seems to have petered out. And of course, we then end up in June 2017 and Grenfell Tower itself, which of course needs no introduction. We will see what the Grenfell inquiry has to say about the decisions made by governments and politicians at that point in time. But of course, it would appear that there was a lost opportunity, and now, given that so many lives have been lost, and so many difficulties have arisen as a result of the use of these particular cladding systems, this is what has ultimately forced the hand of government. Tom, if you could just turn to the next slide. So what did what was the government's response then in light of Grenfell Tower? Well, there were two immediate actions which the government took. The first one, of course, was to instigate the Grenfell Tower inquiry. I'm not really going to talk about that too much. I think it's just worth recollecting that phase one of that report has now been issued. We're now into the evidence gathering for phase two, and the latest, as I hear it, is that Sir Martin Morbick is likely to report back in, well, certainly not before the end of next year, on his conclusions for phase two. So I won't say any more about the Grenfell inquiry itself, other than to commend what Thomas said, that there's plenty of interesting evidence starting to come out of the inquiry, and it's instructive to listen to the podcast and other media which are reporting on it. I think that's probably incumbent amongst all of us who are close to this issue. The second thing that the government did was commission Dame Judith Hackett to conduct her independent review into building regulations and fire safety. I'm sure, again, for many of us in the audience, this will not require a great deal of introduction. Dame Judith reported in May 2018, and her findings were, I think it's probably fair to say, damning and far from complimentary. I'm just going to read a couple of short extracts from what Dame Judith said in her report, and she said as follows: "There's a need for a radical rethink of the whole system and how it works. This is most definitely not just a question of the specification of cladding systems, but of an industry that has not reflected and learnt for itself, nor looked to other sectors." She then goes on to say, "It is essential that this industry now works to implement a truly robust and assured approach to building the increasingly complex structures in which people live." Dame Judith made, I think it's 53 recommendations in total in this report, and interestingly, and perhaps most pertinently for members of the Get It Right initiative, she calls for a clearer delineation of roles and responsibilities, and importantly, a greater emphasis on competence. And as we'll go through the webinar this afternoon, this issue of competence and responsibility becomes clearer and clearer in the way the legislation is structured. Let's go to the next slide, please, Tom. So what happens next? Well, in December 2018, we start to see the government's response. At this stage, there's no legislation being suggested, but there are efforts being made in the government's implementation plan at this point to do a number of things, one of which was to focus upon the issue of competence, and we'll turn to that in some more detail in a moment, and also the suggestion that a new regulatory framework was required. Perhaps most importantly, the government then turned its attention to what it described as generating and encouraging a culture of responsibility and a culture to increase competency. Now, this issue of culture change is one which, it was fascinating. It was mentioned in Dame Judith's initial reports, and perhaps that's where the greatest challenge lies. There's no question that the Building Safety Bill seeks to engender a culture of responsibility, but it does that via, in some instances, quite robust enforcement mechanisms. And really, it ought to be incumbent upon all of us involved in buildings which are affected by the Building Safety Bill to seek to drive that culture change. And of course, from the GIRI Weightmans initiative's perspective, it's been something which has long been called for. Can we have the next slide, please, Tom? So there's a few more developments before we got to the bill, and again, I'll just whip through these fairly quickly. We got a much better idea of what the regulatory proposals and legislation which might be presented could look like in June of last year. And we were told at that stage that there will be legislation affecting all multi-occupied residential buildings 18 metres or higher. Now, that has remained the case, although, as we'll see, the legislation has the power to encompass a wider selection of buildings than just that. The consultation, which was issued in June 2019, also led to the creation of the competency steering group, which we've heard a little bit of already. There was also at this point a suggestion that there be a new building safety regulator, and of course this really becomes the kernel of the legislation, and the single biggest point of focus for all building safety from now on in. The regulator really is the means by which all of this starts to change, and upon which is really the hinge of the whole mechanism. So we will hear a bit more about the regulator's powers in a moment. Next slide, please, Tom. So things started to become a little bit clearer in April of this year. Thankfully, the government has continued to prioritise building safety during the course of COVID-19 over the course of this year. And in fact, there have been various comments to say, well, it's even more important that we get this right, and we get on top of what's necessary, and not let this become stuck in the long grass. So we saw in April 2020 the government's proposals finally coming out. This is before the bill itself was published. What was interesting at this stage is we started to see that new legislation wasn't just going to be directed at those buildings I mentioned a moment ago, at multi-occupied buildings of 18 metres in height, but also to extend that to other types of premises, and also to encompass both new and existing buildings and buildings which are going through refurbishment. The other important focus in the proposals from April, and I won't go through them all, but one that struck me particularly was the idea of putting residents at the heart of the new system of building safety and giving residents a voice. It's been a criticism which has been levelled at the industry to date, that residents haven't been heard and their views haven't been taken into account. So that now changes. And we finally, so as I mentioned earlier, we finally see the bill published in July of this year. So that's how we've got to where we are. As I say, there's a human story which has led to this point, and nothing really moves very quickly in government circles. It's taken us 3 years to get to the stage where we finally have a bill, and even that is going to take some time yet before it becomes law. But now is the time to act and to take into account what the changes which are coming our way. Tom, if you could just turn to the next slide. Right, at this stage, I'll just pass over to my colleague Natalie to take you through what the actual safety system looks like and give you some more detail on the actual nature of the legislation itself. So Natalie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Paul. So, as Paul has said, the Building Safety Bill was first published at the end of July this year. The bill is intended to bring substantial changes to building safety processes to secure the safety of people in or about buildings and improve the standard of buildings. It is complex legislation, as Paul said. The notes are very helpful if you want to take a look at those in a bit more detail, but also a lot of the detail will be set out in regulations that will follow once the bill is approved. Consultation on the bill closed recently, and it may be that further changes are made to the draft bill. The expectation is the initial focus will be multi-occupied residential buildings over 6 stories or 18 metres, but this is subject to change and expansion. For today's purposes, I intend to comment on some of the key provisions of the bill, including the Building Safety Regulator, its role and powers, the bill's introduction of key duty holders with various duties, including reporting to the regulator from planning right through occupation. The bill also introduces sanctions ranging up to unlimited fines and 2 years in prison. It's therefore crucial that the requirements are understood and proactively managed by everybody involved. So first of all, to speak about the regulator itself and its functions. So the regulator will be supported by the Building Advisory Committee, which is established to advise and give information on these issues, a committee on industry competence, and obviously we've mentioned already that the first report from that committee has been published recently, and also a residents committee, which Paul has just mentioned. In addition to that, the support of local authorities and fire and rescue authorities can also be requested or directed. So in short, every corner of the construction industry needs to be aware of the bill to a greater or lesser extent and throughout the supply chain, as well as those involved in funding, legal issues and insurance. First and foremost, the bill addresses the role and powers of the Building Safety Regulator. The regulator will review building safety and standards, assist those responsible for or affected by building safety or standards issues, and assist the improvement of competence in the built environment industry. The regulator will establish the system for the provision of building safety information, and it's expected to be very similar to the current Health and Safety Executive. It will be self-funded through fees and charges. For your information, the Health and Safety Executive is already offering a building safety email bulletin, which might be of interest. The regulator's powers will be wide-ranging, including the ability to publish a new code of conduct for building inspectors. I know that one of the questions raised in the questions so far is in relation to how Murphy and Brentwood might be affected by these new regulations. So that new code of conduct might be very relevant to that. The regulator can also carry out misconduct investigations, issue stop notices, levy fines, and commence criminal prosecutions. Criminal prosecutions can be brought against directors, managers, and officers of companies that have committed an offence with their consent or support. Part 3 of the bill also provides that the regulator will be the building control authority for higher risk buildings, therefore centralising control in relation to those higher risk buildings and removing these from the scope of approved inspectors and local authority building control teams. Again, how this plays out is yet to be seen. In conclusion, the new Building Safety Regulator will become a very prominent body in the construction industry. Moving on to the next slide, let's consider who will have obligations to comply with under the bill. Okay, so whilst the intention is that that building safety regulation, it will require greater accountability from all involved. The Building Safety Bill creates a number of specific duty holders who will have key responsibilities throughout the life of the building. As can be seen from this diagram, all key stakeholders in building design, construction, management, development, all have a role to play to work together to comply with these obligations. This will also extend to residents, which I'll come back to. These roles can be held by individuals or companies, but crucially, they must be held by someone with the experience and skills to fulfil the relevant obligations. These roles involve submitting key information to the regulator, ensuring compliance with building safety requirements, and reviewing this on an ongoing basis to manage and address any risks. The bill gives powers to prescribe competence requirements, and on higher risk buildings, this can include a statement from the client that the competence of the designer and the contractor have been assessed. Practically speaking, for that reason, we might see tender processes and team selection becoming a more stringent process. In particular, careful consideration will need to be given to who is the accountable person and building safety manager during the occupation phase, which I'll move on to discuss in more detail. So moving on to the next topic, what duties will need to be complied with? We can have the next slide then. Yes. First and foremost, I'll consider on a general basis the duties that these new duty holders will have. As I've previously mentioned, it will be key that the duty holders cooperate and share information. The roles generally require ongoing monitoring of various issues, including the competence of others and the evidencing of this to the regulator. The bill defines building safety risk broadly, but particularly mentions fire and structural issues. The bill requires mandatory reporting to the regulator of such issues, and a voluntary scheme for non-significant risks will also operate. The bill will extend existing duties owed by construction professionals, even where they're not duty holders. Breaches of professional duty may arise from failures to obtain approvals from the regulator or share information in a collaborative way. A reporting system must be put in place to ensure those on site during construction and occupation know both when and how to report any potential issues. As I've said, the residents also assume duties, which include obligations to keep items in proper working order and to comply with any requests made by the accountable person, which again I'll come back to. So moving on to the next slide. Whilst I will move on to cover some specific roles and specific duties, thought it was worth being aware of some specific obligations on certain duty holders. For example, throughout the entire life cycle of a higher risk building, there will be a duty holder with responsibility for reviewing and addressing or managing any safety risk and reporting to the regulator as required and providing all information. This extends the need to put systems in place to ensure that any issues are identified and managed promptly. Failure to comply with these duties can result in civil actions, fines, or criminal sanctions that are open to the regulator. At all stages, therefore, collaboration between the duty holders and the regulator will be critical to the success of any project. It will be key that all involved know who is responsible for what and when. In order to preserve the golden thread of information that's required to be kept and submitted to the regulator, and to ensure that safety considerations are in play throughout a construction project, there's a new system of 3 gateways introduced, also known as stop-go decision points. I'll move on to discuss these now within the next 3 slides. So the first gateway is before planning permission is granted. At this stage, the client will be the key duty holder, but it's likely that very strong support will be required from design and planning consultants. Gateway 1 requires information to be submitted to the local planning authority in the form of a fire statement, which demonstrates that fire safety requirements have been considered and incorporated into the development proposals. The regulator will act as a statutory consultee for all planning applications relating to higher risk buildings and will provide fire safety input. Consultation with local fire rescue authorities will also be required at this stage. Next, to consider Gateway 2. So Gateway 2 occurs prior to commencement of construction, and it will be a hard stop, and construction cannot begin until the regulator is satisfied that the design meets the requirements of the building regulations. Key to this is the golden thread of documents required to illustrate building safety issues have been considered and addressed as necessary. Duty holders will be required to submit this information to the regulator to demonstrate compliance. There are evidently contractual, programming and cost implications of these requirements, which will need to be considered properly by the parties. In addition to the need for a clear change management process, as any changes during the construction phase will need to be managed and potentially reported and approved. It's critical that as-built information is up to date and accurate, as a further gateway occurs before occupation can begin. And that's what I'll discuss on the next slide. Thank you. Gateway 3 takes place at completion of works. At this point, all golden thread documentation must be provided at that point to the accountable person, and I'll move on to speak about these roles in a little bit more detail, but that accountable person is responsible for registering any higher risk buildings and seeking the building assurance certificate from the regulator. This stage will require submission of the safety case report, which reports on any risks and how these are to be dealt with or managed, information on the occurrence reporting system, and the resident engagement strategy. And I'll move on to speak about a couple of those items in a bit more detail. Only once the regulator is satisfied that there has been full safety compliance will it issue the building assurance certificate and can occupation happen. That certificate must be prominently displayed in any building as well. It's worth noting at this point that it's yet to be seen how this will be managed and dealt with expeditiously if it's all to be done by the regulator. Of course, we'll have all seen in the news recently about highlights and delays and difficulties in obtaining sign-off of buildings where remedial work, in particular on cladding, has been carried out but have yet to be reviewed and signed off. The potential solution might be to provide information to the regulator as early as possible during the course of construction, which goes back to my point about reviewing things on an ongoing basis and updating information to the regulator rather than doing that towards the end of the project. The accountable person holds a crucial role in many of the obligations in the current bill. This will be the person or body with ownership of common parts or with repair obligations for the common parts. As this role holds key ongoing responsibilities, the ownership structure of such buildings may require careful review to determine and make clear who the accountable person is and to manage any changes in ownership. The accountable person will also be supported by an appointed building safety manager. Whilst the third and final gateway is at the point of occupation, review and reporting obligations do not end there. In fact, ongoing review and management of building safety issues becomes even more vital during the occupancy stage, which I'll now discuss. If I can move on to the next slide. Okay, so once occupation is permitted and during the occupancy phase, the accountable person, who I've just mentioned, must assess the building safety risks and take all reasonable steps to manage those risks, which might include carrying out works. This must be reviewed at regular intervals if there's any reason to believe the position has changed and if required by the regulator. This will need to be demonstrated through the safety case report. That will set out any assessed risks and the steps taken in relation to those risks. That must be kept up to date and provided to the regulator for review, both when it's prepared initially and whenever it's changed. As I've mentioned previously, residents also hold responsibilities regarding maintenance. Good communication between the building safety manager and residents will be crucial. And for that reason, a residents' engagement strategy and complaints procedure must be established and evidenced to the regulator. Now, moving on to the next slide, I'd just like to take a moment to think about culturally what change these new regulations might mean. Of course, there's going to be implications throughout the industry and throughout relationships that might mean changes in construction documents and probably property ownership structures to reflect the new obligations and responsibilities, and also the implications of failure to comply or compliance being delayed. There will also be evident implications for insurance, which Paul is going to discuss in a bit more detail. Essentially, the intent of the bill is to encourage shared responsibility for building safety across all stakeholders, working together to ensure this. In some instances, these issues have been taken out of the hands of the stakeholders even further, and I'll now cover briefly the further external regulation and monitoring set out in the bill. Just moving on to the next slide. Thank you. The bill also proposes some changes to the building control system. Closer, centralised regulation of building control will happen, as I mentioned at the outset, in particular in relation to higher risk buildings, where the regulator will be the building control authority. Of course, at present, there's press coverage around this, and it'll be interesting to see as the consultation proceeds and the bill goes through Parliament as to if there's any further comments on how that will be dealt with and how the regulator will manage that role. Moving on to the next slide, please. I just wanted to recap at this point on the higher risk buildings mentioned in the bill. I've covered the key provisions around these, but just want to reiterate the wholesale change in approach as to how building safety on those buildings will be managed. The ongoing review, reporting and approval at every key stage of construction and on an ongoing basis once occupation occurs. As I've mentioned, the definition of a higher risk building is subject to change, and we consider it's probably likely that this will be extended in due course. One issue the bill doesn't expressly comment on, which has been prevalent in discussions around the building safety, is how the cost of dealing with any failures might be met. However, the bill notes do explain that the hope is that leaseholders should not have to face unaffordable costs. The government has recently published statistics in relation to the funding that was available for remediation of non-ACN cladding. I won't cover this in any detail, but what the message that's to be taken from those statistics is that it seems that only quite a small proportion of those applications for funding are proceeding. The indications are that prior to the bill being finalised, then cost issues will be considered further. Of course, the Building Safety Bill is not the sole source of building safety reform, and in some of my final comments, I just want to cover some of the other changes currently being made. We can move on to the next slide. Okay, I'd just like to briefly mention the new Homes Ombudsman and the Construction Products Reform. The new Homes Ombudsman will provide purchasers and occupants of new properties with a route to make complaints and seek redress from developers. It's part of a government drive to build sustainable, high-quality homes as the provision for new homes reaches a 30-year high. All developers are expected to be subject to the scheme with the exception of self-builders, unless the property is intended to be sold to someone else within a given period. The scheme will be funded by the members and free to consumers. The NHO's powers will include awarding compensation, requiring remedial work to be undertaken, issuing directions to improve service, and most significantly, expelling developers from the scheme. The bill also permits regulations to be made regarding construction products. Those regulations might deal with declarations of performance in respect of products, regulation of marking or packaging of products, monitoring, assessment and verification of product performance, including sample testing, regulations on storage and transportation, and recording and investigating complaints and risks. In conclusion, the Building Safety Bill and its associated provisions will apply to every aspect of the industry to a certain extent, and in particular higher risk buildings. In conclusion, detailed consideration of current rules, procedures and documents need to take place by everybody. And at that point, I'll hand back to Paul, who'll move on to our next topic, what this might mean for claims and underwriting.
Thank you, Natalie. That's very helpful. The two things I'd just like to touch on, which Natalie has mentioned in outline. The first one is, it's very clear in the legislation that the hand of the HSE lies very heavy over the draft bill. And I say that because it's fairly obvious that the duty holder regime mirrors closely what we see in the existing CDM regulations. We ought not to be surprised by that, because let's not forget, Dame Judith Hackett was for many years chief executive at HSE, and so what's happened is that following Dame Judith's recommendations, CDM regulations have become the go-to framework, which are now being mirrored in the world of building safety. So that is, I think, a very obvious link between the health and safety executive and the building safety bill. The other aspect, which is an obvious thing to health and safety as well, is that the building safety regulator is located in the health and safety executive. In fact, the new regulator is effectively just a branch of the HSE. So again, you can see Dame Judith's influence creeping through how the legislation is being framed and the actual mechanics of the process of building safety. Okay, well, I think Natalie's given us quite a fairly detailed review of what we've seen in the bill. I just want to take one little step back and consider what all this means for us, for the types of problems we encounter, and also touch upon what that might mean for the way insurances operate too, because there's an interesting angle on that. I guess the headline point is, if the bill does what it says it does and achieves its objectives, we ought to be looking at a safer construction industry, which is more efficient and more profitable, and ultimately leads to less claims to insurers, and therefore hopefully lower premiums as well. So we ought to welcome the bill, it seems to me, and all stakeholders ought to be ought to see it in that light. But of course, as with all things in life, what is given on one hand is taken away in the other. So whilst we have that very noble ambition of the bill, on the other hand, we also start to see an extensive new set of duties placed on professionals, and I'll describe that in a little bit more detail in a moment. What do we think mandatory reporting means, and how ought you to deal with that when it comes to your insurances? And also this issue about regulatory fines, how will they be looked after if you're found to be in breach of your duties and the regulator takes action, and will there be insurance available for those fines? So I'll just turn to that in a little bit more detail now. Tom, if I can have the next slide, please. I mentioned a moment ago that our extensive new duties, and we've seen that in the duty holder regime. Now, there are authorities in this area, and the leading one is one called AB and Pronation. And those authorities tend to indicate that when you have a regulatory obligation of this nature, that will ultimately lead to an extension of a professional duty owed by a construction professional. So what does that mean? What does that mean in practice? Well, I think what we can say that means is if, for instance, you are an architect, an engineer, a contractor with design obligations, if you are found to have been in breach of and failed to comply with your obligations under the bill, that is likely to also be viewed as a breach of your professional duty to whoever has appointed you. So take an example of an architect who has not been novated to the contractor, it might be considered a breach of your professional appointment if any of your actions, let's say as principal designer, have caused the project to stall and the requirements which Natalie very kindly detailed to not be complied with. So there's an issue there. There's an issue of extending these professional duties. I also find absolutely fascinating the suggestion that of the creation of the building safety manager. So to my mind, this is perhaps one of the most novel developments out of the whole piece of legislation. We are now effectively having the creation of a new profession. I don't think that the building safety manager amounts to the role currently undertaken by managing agents. I don't think it's a building surveyor either. It's somebody who has to be comfortable and competent to deal with fire and structural risks. So we have as well as these extensive new duties being placed on construction professionals, we also have what seems to me to be the creation of a entirely new profession. And one of the big questions about how this bill will actually come into force is this issue of how we're going to find people to take on that role. Okay, Tom, next slide, please. Thanks for that. We heard Natalie talk about the mandatory reporting regime, and again, I find this another fascinating development, and one which I think aligns itself with what the GIRI Weightmans initiative has long been calling for, which is greater transparency when it comes to problems that are encountered on jobs. In this instance, we're now going to be faced with mandatory reporting for structural safety and fire safety issues when they are perceived to represent a significant risk to life or to significant damage to property. There's also at the same time a voluntary notification and reporting regime in place where people can, on a voluntary basis, notify the regulator where they think there's a significant problem, but which falls short of the mandatory reporting regime. There's also at the same time a whistleblower regime in the bill as well, so that somebody who makes one of these reports can't then be victimized by his or her employer. So this is again a fascinating development. I think it's great for clarity and disclosure, but of course then it does pose some problems for how you deal with your insurers, and the question I think which will need to be considered is, if these types of reports are being met, does that automatically mean you need to tell your insurers? Does it automatically mean that a claim is likely to arise, which would amount to a circumstance under various insurance policies? That I guess remains to be seen. I suspect it will probably be prudent, given the nature of these reports, that those steps are taken and insurers are involved at an early juncture. But certainly something that needs to be considered as the bill goes through the House. Next slide, please, Tom. Now we've heard the building safety regulators spoken about a lot, but what really are the sanctions and the enforcement powers which are available to the regulator? Well, they seem to me to be quite draconian and quite broad ranging. So ranging from issuing stop notices on projects where there has been, for instance, a failure to successfully achieve one of the three gateways, for instance, and I think we'll often see stop notices perhaps starting to be issued at the early phases of a job, perhaps at the design phase, perhaps gateway 1, where we have to put, as you'll recall, we had to be putting together a fire safety statement to satisfy the regulator. And I guess it's at that type of stage, before there's a spades and shovels get into the ground, the regulator will be keen to issue those stop notices. But we'll also like to see civil fines and criminal prosecutions arising from failure to comply. I suspect that these more draconian enforcement powers are more likely to emerge probably during the occupancy phase of a project, but it certainly isn't limited to that. The criminal powers open to the regulator are to prosecute managers and directors of organisations who are in default of their obligations, which I suspect will make many in the audience today take notice, because there's I don't think many of us will want to be faced with a criminal prosecution, an investigation, and potentially a prison sentence arising from failure to comply. This issue about regulatory fines, the regulator will have the power to issue fines against businesses. It's not clear yet, at least not clear to me anyway, the scale of what those fines are likely to be. I think we can expect them to be significant, because we are dealing here with issues of life and death, let's not forget. The corollary to that is, will these fines be insurable? And there are various schools of thought on that. I think actually from a practical perspective, it's very unlikely that insurers are going to be interested in offering any form of insurance cover. Perhaps firstly for public policy reasons, doesn't look particularly good to be insuring against these types of issues, and secondly because the insurance market, particularly as many of you will be aware, has gone through a period of what might be described as distress in the construction world at the moment, and unlikely to have an appetite for taking on more risk. But these are things we'll need to be aware of, and particularly considerations given to notifying directors and officers, insurers, if we get to the stage of a prosecution being commenced by the regulator. Okay, Tom, next slide. I kind of thought it might be instructive to just think about case studies, and there are plenty of case studies that we could turn to here. I'm also conscious that I would quite like to get to some of the questions and answers. I'm noting that the time is getting the better of us, so I won't spend too long on this. I just, for instance, one scenario I had imagined, and there are plenty of these, and we can of course do a separate session going through more detailed case studies. But the type of thing we might start to see, it seems to me, are, let's take the example of a design and build contractor who's active on a commercial project, or alternatively, imagine that you're acting on a high-rise residential, which falls clearly within the scope of the regime. And you get to Gateway 3, and there's found to be a failure of one of the M&E systems. Perhaps it's the smoke extraction system, which is not dissimilar to what's been discussed in the Grenfell inquiry at the moment. And the regulator is not satisfied, and you're not given approval to go through to the occupancy phase. What's likely to happen at that point? Well, I suppose there are a number of actions which will flow from that. It seems to be that the first one will be, there's a stop notice. There's likely to be problems now achieving practical completion on jobs. Sorry, excuse me, that's my other phone going off at the moment. Let me just sort that out, sorry. Okay, back on now. That was an interesting interruption. Just very quickly turning to the to this case study. Yeah, so I think what will happen in that type of situation, well, there's going to have to be consideration given by the contractor to notifying perhaps its insurers. Will a prosecution be started because there's been a failure to achieve the occupation status? Will there then be an investigation as to why that's happened? Did people notice at an earlier juncture there's a particular problem with this M&E system? Will the M&E consultants itself be subject to a regulatory investigation? So I think these are all the sorts of things that are likely to become complicated as we see the bill coming into force. So, like I said, I won't spend too much time on the case studies. I think there are plenty of things we can say on that front. Tom, can you just turn to the next slide? Right, this is again something very briefly just to touch upon, and it's really one which is in the headlines at the moment. it's a political issue, and it's likely to feature within the bill, as I understand it, which is this continuing problem for what are described as trapped leaseholders, and how we deal with this particular issue. I won't spend too much time thinking about it. I'm not certain it's the focus of what people on the webinar want to spend time thinking about at the moment. But very briefly, you may well have seen the papers of late, criticism being levelled at government and others with how to address the problem where leaseholders are in blocks of flats and they are unable to remortgage and sell because of unsafe cladding, which hasn't yet been remediated. And the reason for the failure to remediate has rested upon the lack of funds available to them to carry out those remediation works. So I think the bill is likely to address this in one form or another, and that there may well be some form of risk transfer mechanism. So watch the space, I guess, is the point I'll make on that one. Okay, again, conscious of time, Tom, I think the next slide is our Q&A. So I think it might be the juncture to open up to the floor.
Okay, yeah, we'll do that. Excuse me, just if I get the technology right. Right, okay. I think we're just have the slides like that, and if you can hear me, we've had a number of questions, and we'll start with the first one, which Natalie referred to briefly, which was could the presenters at some point touch base on how the new legislation may affect Murphy and Brentwood? So Natalie, I think that's for you.
A delay on my mute button, so apologies. Yes, so obviously Murphy and Brentwood dealt with kind of liability of local building control bodies. Now, generally speaking, the consensus is that whilst there's difficulties in holding such bodies accountable for failures, it's not impossible. Now, in terms of the bill, obviously in relation to higher risk buildings, we've got a completely new situation, which is that the regulator is going to deal with building control for higher risk buildings. So that's somewhat uncharted territory at the minute. In relation to anything that's not a higher risk building at the minute, and whether the regulations that are set down, as we've kind of discussed, there's potential extensions of liabilities. But ultimately, I think, as I said, we are moving into uncharted waters generally, because previously building control would have been, the final point of contact. Now all of that information needs to go to the regulator for consideration. And I think it's going to be a case of seeing how that pans out. And part of the regulator's role is in reviewing the information it receives and in generally providing updates to the industry. So I think it will be somewhat of a learning curve then in terms of basically whether it feeds back common issues that it's seeing, and therefore if that those are not picked up, if that will be an issue. But to a certain extent, because of the regulator, we are moving into new territory here, so it will be a case of seeing how that pans out and seeing what the regulations ultimately say. But on a general basis, there is definitely scope for the roles and the duties of anybody involved being extended.
I might just expand on that a little bit. I think it's an interesting question. Murphy and Brentwood was quite an old case now, actually. It's a House of Lords decision, I think back in mid-90s. It's been relied upon in a number of areas. I mean, it's really an issue to do with how loss is attributed when you are faced with an issue of pure economic loss. I mean, the facts were interesting at the time of Murphy and Brentwood. it was to do with building control, who had approved the building, and future owners of that building, when it was discovered that there were structural defects with the building, wanted to bring a claim against building control for the decisions they made. Now, the reason why that claim wasn't successful is because, and the principle which was set down by Murphy and Brentwood, was that pure economic loss, where there's no damage to property for that particular party, does not give rise to an actionable claim. Now, and again, it's been as a consequence of that, it's been relied upon by building control over the years. I think my feeling is that the bill is going to change this. I suspect that building control will not have this immunity that has been that Murphy and Brentwood has provided over the years. I think the mood music is changing on that, but of course, if the whole building safety regime really is dependent upon people getting it right, and I suspect that building control now are going to be faced with a different dynamic. I mean, as things stand, Murphy and Brentwood is good law, but I wonder if that will remain to be the case in the future.
Thanks, Paul, for that. The next one is, does Gateway 2 still assume that the principal designer is the lead designer, as it appears to do so? And I'm going to add a supplementary, if I may, and that is because perhaps it shows my lack of understanding. But in terms of a design that's approved, where does the design of key specialist subcontractors, such as fire alarm contractors and so on, fit in? And when do they have to be appointed? And do they have to be appointed before Gateway 2?
Well,
Natalie?
Yeah. So, as I kind of said, obviously the duty holders are the person with ultimate responsibility to collate this information and ensure it's provided to the relevant person at the relevant gateway. In most instances, that will be the regulator. But it is very much a case of there's going to be a need for collaboration from everybody involved in any aspect of the design and construction that will, funnel into that information that needs to go to the regulator to assist in that compliance. And that's why I mentioned that, it probably will mean a need to review contractual requirements and things like that to ensure that where there is responsibility, that people are held to that. But ultimately, I think going back to the source of the original question, the bill is intended to work alongside the existing CDM regulations, and there probably will be an element of kind of overlap in the roles. But at the minute, it's intended to work alongside, and therefore obligations under CDM will overlap and feed into the responsibility of those duty holders in collating and providing this information.
Okay, thanks for that, Natalie. The next question is, what specifically would the Gateway 1 fire statement contain? Has that been determined yet?
So from recollection, it identifies fire risks and basically proposals for seeking to address them. Obviously, it's quite high level and vague at the minute, but that might extend to liaising with the local fire authorities, as I've mentioned. There's requirements about needing to provide, plans, etc., to the local fire authorities. So at the minute, the requirement is very high level and vague. So obviously, the detail underneath that could be quite substantial.
I'll just add there. I think we will see what comes out in the secondary legislation, which is where some of this detail is going to be found, which hasn't been published yet. I think when we talk about what is going to need to be put at the very outset in that fire safety case, it's going to be things like, have you considered access to site? Is there water available? How can emergency services get there? It's that type of very generic thing, which I suspect is what's going to be required, and that's the indication given in the explanatory notes as well. Just going back to the earlier question of what do we do about specialist subcontractors? When do they come in, and when do they need to be appointed, and what roles they play in all of this? I suspect the points really to think about here are Gateway 2. you'll recall, Natalie, we were talking about a gateway to this. So this is before we get into construction. The client needs to build a safety case, and at that stage, the principal designer and the principal contractor are working on what's called the construction control plan. So this is all the planning which is necessary to enable the site to work safely and for fire and safety risks to be managed. So I suspect we'll see that coming in there. I think we'll also start to see it coming in at Gateway 3 as well, where there's this declaration of compliance by the principal designer and principal contractor. I think at that stage, again, all those issues when it comes to engaging with our specialists will have to be built in for the purposes of putting in the Gateway 3 approvals.
Thanks, Paul and Natalie. So the next one is, in relation to who is the accountable person, if you have a property management agent appointed by, for example, a freeholder, could the agent be the accountable party if they assume under their agreement with the owner obligations to carry out repairs, but only as agent?
I'll take this one first. One thing I haven't mentioned yet is that I've been helping out government on some of these issues and the implementation of the bill. And one of the bits, the sticking points, is this issue about the accountable person. Who is it? It's not clear, to be honest, in the bill. And ministers and civil servants are aware there needs to be greater clarity provided. It's very unlikely to be a managing agent. It's much more likely the accountable person is going to be somebody like the freeholder who has an interest in the property. I think in most cases it will be the freeholder. There are, of course, sometimes complex management and ownership structures in buildings, and there are plenty of instances where there are freeholders who might be who are not domiciled in this jurisdiction, and there might be shared ownership and more complex ownership structures. And I think the bigger issue will be, in those circumstances, who will be the accountable person? So the thinking at the moment is that it ought to be the freeholder. I think the managing agent's role perhaps will be more akin to what's expected from the building safety manager. And as I mentioned, that role is the day-to-day running of the property and its fire and structural risks. And those obligations are quite onerous. I'm not sure that there are too many agents who will want to step into the shoes of the building safety manager. But as for the accountable person, I think we can be fairly confident that that obligation will rest with those who've got an actual interest in the property, and it won't be delegated to. It can't be delegated to others.
Thanks, Paul, for that. If I go to the next one, is how does the principal designer role under the Building Safety Britain relate to the existing principal designer role under CDM? Is it envisaged that they will always be the same person? I'm assuming yes, as it would be very confusing if not, but I haven't seen this stated explicitly anywhere.
Yeah, as you said, kind of answering, yeah, I mean, as this will be running in parallel with CDM, and there will be an overlap in roles. So, as you say, practically speaking, whether it says so expressly in the bill or not, I would imagine practically speaking that on any given project, if there's a principal and a lead designer for CDM purposes, then they would be the obvious candidate for fulfilling a similar role as required under the bill.
Okay, thanks for that. The next question is, it's more of a statement, I think. In reading the bill and the guidance, my view is that the golden thread that we need to focus on is quality, e.g. the quality of design, quality of construction, HSE led and CCS supported. This isn't about safety and being considerate on site. This is about quality of the site. Taking the mantra from nuclear, today's quality is tomorrow's safety. The building sector in general isn't set up to provide this level of design freeze, construction assurance, and dare I say it, competence and consultation within the contracts it currently operates. From my reading, ICE and CIOB and us in GIRI need to make more noise and thought leadership around this aspect to the bill. Would either of you like to comment on that?
I think there's no question that this bill is going to pose challenges to anyone who's seeking to comply with it. Okay, I mean, I think that's my first observation. And I don't, it's no great surprise, is it really, having read what Dame Judith Hackett said in May 2018, the issue of qualities and competence are absolutely the forefront of this. If you actually read the introduction to the bill, I think it almost says that expressly in terms. So, I think that's right. I think, getting it right and quality will improve, and it will lead to compliance with these regulations. Let's not get away from the fact that you are still going to have strict obligations on this bill to comply with. There's no getting away from that. You're still going to have to go through this process. I would, in fact, like to see that compliance actually driving culture change, driving quality, and driving a greater assumption of responsibility. And I agree. I think that Get It Right initiative and other bodies do have a role to play, and particularly in things like the competency steering group and influencing perhaps some of the discussions in Parliament as this starts to go through in the coming months.
I'm just going to add something to that, and that is if we take a parallel with health and safety. The industry finally started to do something about it when there was serious legal requirements put on the industry as a whole. And whilst, of course, that's not perfect by any means, we're a lot better than we used to be. And it certainly improved our culture. I mean, most people who've heard me heard me say is, at the end of the day, we're only going to actually manage to do what we're being asked to do if we have the right culture. And I think what you will see to start with is some organizations, as Judith Hackett was warning in the statement I read out earlier, maybe don't think it's that important. And some people will probably learn the hard way that it is important. And you may well see projects which are stuck because they can't demonstrate that they've got a golden thread or whatever. So I think that that sort of we do have to raise the game, and we do actually have to really get people to ensure that it's important. But it's interesting, the reference was made to the nuclear industry. If you go and see what's going on in somewhere like Hinckley, there's some pretty good examples of how you can get it right if you really try. So anyway, that's enough of my soapbox, but I'll move on to the next question. The next question was, some of the duties appear to mirror those of the CDM regulations. Has this potential duplication for higher risk building construction been considered in the development of the bill?
Well, my point or observation is, I think it's actually intentional. Actually, I think that's the part of all of this is this heavy influence of the HSE and then Judith Hackett, and I think there is designed to be a degree of overlap between the duties in the CDM regs and what we see in the bill. Natalie, is anything, would you disagree with that, or?
No, I completely agree.
Okay, that's fine. The next question is probably a short answer, but I don't know. Apologies if this was covered. I don't think it has been, but is there any visibility on timing for the final approval of the Building Safety Bill at this stage? Appreciate it has yet to be debated and it may be amended, but any idea of when you would expect it to come into law?
The short answer to that is no, there is no timescale. I think in practice, we're going through committee stage very soon. Will then be debated in the House of Commons. I think, and there are other issues in it, as you heard me mention a moment ago. This issue of cladding remediation may well have to be, the bill may have to be amended to deal with that particular issue. I think my best guess would be that we're probably looking at some point later next year before this successfully goes through Parliament. I think the saving grace is that politicians see this as important and see that the job needs to get done. So it's not going to be, debated and never reach statute books. That is not the case. My feeling is we're probably second half of next year is when this is more realistically likely to be law, maybe 2022.
Okay, thanks for that, Paul. The next question is there an obligation on main contractors to use competent subcontractors when tendering? How would this work in getting their subcontractors up to date on regulations and compliance?
Yes, so I guess if I could take that one, that's probably a good time to mention in a little bit more detail what the steering group has said on the competence issues. So the initial report from the steering group is suggested an overarching system of competence. So there's a competence committee sitting with the building safety regulator, and the recommendations are for a national suite of competence standards and a system for assessing compliance with those standards. So that will give a greater indication as to how exactly the competence can be maintained and measured throughout the supply chain. As I think I mentioned early on, there is a requirement to give a competence statement. I believe from recollection it's the client who needs to give that. So as I say, I can see tender processes becoming a lot more stringent in terms of seeking to ensure and test compliance at that stage. And I think just whilst I'm speaking about the steering group's report, I think one of the other questions to preempt it was a question about the building safety manager and the steering group report, and rightly so, because I should add that the annexures to that report do give specific recommendations relating to the role of the building safety manager. So that does give us now, only recently published, but a bit more insight into exactly what will be involved there.
Okay, thanks for that, Natalie. Paul, have you got anything more you want to add, or are you happy with that?
No, I think that's a fair answer.
Okay, good. A question I think that's quite important. Any impact on sub 18 metre projects at all?
Yes, I think is the answer. I mean, I think I'm not sure we touched on it yet, but I ought to emphasise that the requirements of the bill apply to existing buildings as well. So where you've got any building which is in occupation, and it is, as some said, over 18 metres, then all these duties will start to apply. Anyway, so on the issue of 18 metres, the bill provides the regulator with discretion to extend these powers to what it considers to be sensitive buildings. So it's not the regulator is not obliged at the moment to act on that, but I think it almost certainly will. And my feeling is other types of sensitive buildings, public buildings, commercial buildings potentially, where there's large numbers of people in occupancy, will start to fall within the remit of the legislation. So I guess there is the potential. I think it's likely to come into force. We'll have to wait and see before it happens. My feeling at the moment is that it will likely have a significant impact on some of the more sensitive buildings that we're dealing with, even if they are less than 18 metres.
Okay, thanks, Paul. I mean, yes, we've certainly, you and I have discussed some of the other types of projects that might well be involved, and I'm sure it's got to be right for some of the others to be included. Well, we've actually reached the end of the time that we've got. So I think that just about concludes the questions we've had. So I really just, for my point of view, would like to just, first of all, thank you to everybody who asked the questions. Secondly, thank you to everybody who attended. I hope you found it useful and interesting. And then finally, I think just the most important thing is, Paul talked about the human side. I mentioned the human side. This is about actually preventing tragedies such as Grenfell happening again. And I think we all have to recognise that. There's lots of things we've got to do. There's the law that we're going to be required to comply with. And there'll be an easy way and a difficult way of complying with the law, or an easier, maybe never be an easy way, but there's certainly an easier way. And the one way we can do is if we actually all set our minds at every stage of the process to try and do our bit correctly and do our bit right. And if we do that, and if we obviously make sure we've got the golden thread, then we're in a better chance of actually complying in a way that we all feel comfortable with, which I think is where we want to be and where as an industry we want to be. So when we actually deliver projects for the people who live around us. So with that, I'd like to just thank you for attending, and just GIRI continues to run events, and so as you will see there, we've got a forum actually coming on Monday, more down to earth, if you like. Are your checking procedures fit for purpose? And that actually is pretty relevant to what we've just been talking about today, basically. So with that, I'd like to thank you for attending, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.